Welcome to today's webinar, Losing a Loved One to Homicide. What do we know from research and practice? My name is Susan Howley, and I am the Program Director for the Center for Victim Research. The center is built through a partnership between three organizations of researchers and practitioners at the Justice Research and Statistics Association, the National Center for Victims of Crime, and the Urban Institute. CVR's mission is to serve as a one-stop resource for victim service providers and researchers to connect and share knowledge, to increase access to victim research and data, and to increase the utility of research and data collection to crime victim services nationwide. Today's webinar is designed to address both of those by sharing what we've learned from the evidence around homicide co-victimization. The CVR and this webinar are supported by funding from the Office for Victims of Crime, U.S. Department of Justice. And with that, I would like to enthusiastically welcome today's presenters. Sara Bastomski will introduce herself and her co-presenters. Sara?
Okay, thanks, Susan. We're all very glad to be here today. So my name is Sara Bastomski, and I am a research associate at the Urban Institute's Justice Policy Center, where I conduct research and evaluations on crime victimization and criminal justice policy. I'm a quantitative social scientist by training, and I earned my PhD in sociology at Yale. I'll turn it over now to Marina Duane so that she can introduce herself as well.
Thank you, Sara. Greetings, everyone from Washington, D.C. My name is Marina Duane. I'm also a research associate at the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute. A lot of my research focuses on the intersection of victimization and corrections and reentry. And also, a lot of what I do is translate research into practice and provide research-oriented technical assistance to different jurisdictions across the country. And I'm going to turn it over to my fellow presenter, Jeff, to introduce himself.
Thank you. My name is Jeff Dion. I serve as the Executive Director of the National Compassion Fund, which collects and distributes charitable contributions in the aftermath of mass casualty crimes. For more than 25 years, I've been providing training and technical assistance, working with all types of homicide survivors, and I'm delighted to be with you on this webinar today.
Okay, thanks, Marina and Jeff. So I'm going to begin, before we dive into material, by giving an overview of the topics that we will cover in today's webinar. So I'll begin by giving a brief summary of the goals of our evidence synthesis on homicide co-victims, as well as the methods that we use to review research, as well as practice-based evidence sources. I'll cover some of the basics, including the Center for Victim Research's definition of homicide co-victims, and I'll then address some key information about the prevalence of homicide co-victimization, as well as risk factors related to co-victimization. Next, I'll address the 4 types of harms that are associated with homicide co-victimization, and in the latter half of the presentation, we'll shift gears to focusing on interventions and services. Marina will review the types of services available to co-victims and discuss some of the strengths and weaknesses of these services. Marina will then talk about the gaps in research and in practice evidence and where the field needs to grow and move forward. Finally, throughout the presentation, Marina and I will ask Jeff Dion to speak about his professional experience working with and advocating for homicide co-victims. We've also reserved time at the end of the presentation to respond to questions and comments from folks in the audience, and we're really eager to hear from all of you today, so please do submit questions throughout the talk. Okay, so we'll dive right into the material. So our synthesis on homicide co-victimization is the first in a series of evidence syntheses on pressing victimization topics. The purpose of CVR's Evidence Syntheses project is to assess the state of the field in crime victimization and victim response in order to help researchers, service providers, and policymakers understand and prioritize what the field needs to improve victim services nationwide. So we had several specific objectives across these projects. First, we're identifying the scale of available evidence on the topic. Second, we're summarizing findings from the best available evidence. And third, we're showing how the evidence differs across different demographic groups, paying special attention to underserved populations. So in order to select and assess appropriate sources of evidence for our synthesis, we developed a framework by drawing from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC's, Evidence Project. The CDC's Evidence Project emphasizes the importance of integrating knowledge from the best available research and experiential practice evidence, as well as contextual evidence. So with this in mind, for our synthesis on homicide co-victimization, we reviewed and integrated evidence drawn from both research and practice-based sources, while also paying attention to the context that applies to each piece of evidence that we use. Our primary focus was on reviewing materials available in the United States from the years 2000 to present, including research sources, particularly journal articles, as well as practice-based materials such as reports, fact sheets, briefs, and videos found across the internet, and especially ones that were available through topic-relevant organizations. So I will turn it to Marina, who's going to briefly speak about some of the practice evidence that she worked with.
Thank you, Sarah. So what the CDC framework does is it expands our typical understanding of what constitutes evidence. And it really prompts us to think about evidence beyond just traditional research studies and articles. This framework also happens to align very well with our Center of Victim Research mission to bridge the gap between research and practice. And simply put, as many of us know in everyday life, some research studies do not always offer the rich context of program operations or clients' experiences, but practitioners who work with people on the ground, like many of you who joined us, do have that context. So we wanted to reflect this rich context and incorporate it into our practice evidence and make it an integral part of this whole research. We combed through many documents, and as Sarah mentioned, we ended up with 172 practice sources that we examined very closely and applied a rigor that we tend to apply in conducting traditional research. So a lot of what I will be sharing today with you comes from summarizing the findings from this practice evidence. Sarah, and I'm going to turn it back to you now.
Okay, thanks, Marina. And then I'll also say, as we've noted in the slide, we also ultimately reviewed 147 research articles on this topic as well, after lots of screening for quality. Okay, so in synthesizing all of our materials across the research and practice evidence space, we sought to address 5 key questions. First, how many co-victims are there? So in other words, what is the prevalence of co-victimization in the US? Second, what are the key risk factors for co-victimization? Third, what are some of the harms and consequences that are associated with homicide co-victimization? And then our fourth question was, what are the key interventions and services available to co-victims? Our final question was, what are the policy, practice, and research implications of our findings? Okay, so now that we've given you an overview of our approach, I'll turn to our findings. So one of the first things that we did in our review process was, of course, to establish the terminology we would use, as well as a definition of homicide co-victimization and scope conditions for our review. So after reviewing initial pieces of evidence and speaking with subject area experts on the topic, we determined that CVR would use the term homicide co-victim to describe this particular group of victims. However, it's important for me to note that some sources also refer to this group as homicide survivors or secondary victims of homicide. A recent article that came out used the term people exposed to the homicide of a loved one. So there's definitely a lot of different terminology. And then drawing from both research and practice evidence sources, we define homicide co-victims as people who have lost a loved one to homicide, This may include family members, other relatives or kin, and friends of the deceased. In terms of scope conditions, we did not focus on loved ones who were lost to non-criminal causes, including suicide. We also didn't focus on those killed in the line of duty, such as police or military deaths, or those killed in episodes of mass violence. Although certainly some of the information in our review could be applicable to these various groups. Okay, we'll now discuss prevalence. So it's important to note that homicide co-victimization statistics are not collected at the national level. So we ended up estimating national prevalence by drawing from statistics on homicide, which of course are collected at the national level. So we looked at some of the statistics, and in 2016, there were over 21,250 deaths due to homicide in the US. About 81% of these are criminal homicides reported by the FBI, and about 19% were alcohol-related vehicular homicides, also known as drunk driving-related deaths, that are reported by the National Highway Safety Traffic Administration. So scholars estimate that a homicide impacts anywhere between 3 to 10 loved ones. 3 would be a very, very conservative estimate. But this means that approximately 64,000 to 213,000 people lose a loved one to homicide on an annual basis, so each year. We also looked at the research on lifetime prevalence of homicide co-victimization. So estimates here indicate that anywhere from 9 to 18% of the adolescent and adult US population experiences co-victimization at some point in their lifetime. These estimates vary substantially because national level studies on this topic are very limited and lacking. We'll speak more about that towards the end of the talk as well. So importantly, qualitative research and practice-based evidence indicate that rates of homicide co-victimization are much higher in marginalized communities that experience high rates of homicide. So there's limited research available on risk factors associated with homicide co-victimization. But in general, we'd expect risk patterns for co-victimization to mirror those for homicide victimization. So one implication of this is that race will be an important risk factor for co-victimization. So for example, because risk of homicide is elevated for the Black community and Latinx community, this suggests that risk of homicide co-victimization will also be similarly elevated for these groups. So national studies do support this expectation. Findings show that Black adult and adolescents, as well as Latinx adolescents, face heightened risk of homicide co-victimization. Specific estimates of these risks vary substantially, but qualitative research support these findings as well. So notably, Black adults and adolescents and Latinx adolescents are overrepresented as co-victims of criminal homicide, but not vehicular homicide. So there's limited research, but substantial practice evidence that suggests that Native Americans are at an elevated risk of co-victimization. And I'll let Marina speak briefly about this finding as well.
Thank you, Sarah. That's correct. So similarly to Black and Latinx communities, Native Americans report experiencing victimization at a higher rate. And in our practice review, we've seen that many national and local advocate organizations particularly draw the attention to the high risk among women. There is some research available that showed that in some counties, the homicide risk among Native American women is 10 times higher than the national average. This means that lots of their loved ones and families are in need of support in the communities where services sometimes are not either readily available or not culturally competent. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to walk us through harms and consequences.
Okay, thanks, Marina. So research and practice evidence demonstrate that there are 4 main categories of harms associated with homicide co-victimization. So first, psychological harms such as distress or mental health concerns. Second, physical harms ranging from things like trouble sleeping to heart conditions. There are also social harms, such as negative impacts to relationships. And finally, economic harms, things like material hardships or other troubles with expenses. So before we go into details on each of these, we'd like to hear from all of you in the audience. We have a short poll for everybody, so I will pause for just a second for folks to get familiar with this. So we're interested to hear in your experiences, which category or type of harms are the most common among homicide co-victims. And please just think about co-victims that you've worked with or that you study if you're a researcher. So I'll pause for just a second. Okay, please continue to submit your responses. I'm going to move forward and then we will have the results compiled and I'll read them back to folks in just a few minutes. So while we're waiting for the poll results, I'll just share an example of psychological harms that are faced by co-victims. So this quote comes from a homicide co-victim who participated in a qualitative study conducted by Dr. Gianna Mastersink and colleagues. So this quote underscores how the experience of homicide co-victimization has left the individual with a heightened sense of anxiety whenever someone knocks on the door. So this particular participant said, "To this day, when I hear this knocking on the table, like a knocking on the door sound, that's how the police came to my door. If you ring the doorbell, I'm fine. When I hear somebody knock on the door, I have an absolute panic attack for about half a second, much less than it used to be." Okay, it looks like we have our results from our poll. Oh, a couple of people haven't responded. Okay, so it looks like, but I'm going to just go ahead. There's a pretty strong trend in the results from the audience poll. It looks like the vast majority of folks highlighted that psychological harms are really important to homicide co-victims and are a particularly important need to get services for. And that's pretty consistent with what the research and practice evidence showed as well. So we'll talk about that as well in just a few minutes. So there's a second quote from qualitative research by Tanya Sharp. And this particular interview with a homicide co-victim found the participant said, "If people don't go through the situation that's happening at hand, you think that nobody can understand because they weren't in that predicament. Those who live a hard life don't want to talk to anybody because they feel as though anyone else who does not live a hard life won't understand." And so this underscores one of the social harms that can happen to homicide co-victims, a sense of isolation from other people who might not understand their experience. Okay, so we'll talk in a little more detail about each of these categories of harms next. So in terms of psychological harms, the research literature on consequences of co-victimization is the most robust in identifying psychological harms that are frequently faced by co-victims. And it sounds like from our audience poll that this is also consistent with many people's experience working with or studying co-victims. So homicidal loss can result in psychological trauma in that it can shatter a person's sense of security and meaning, altering their worldview and sense of self. Grief that's associated with bereavement is thought to be compounded for homicide co-victims by the violent and unexpected nature of their loved one's death. So along these lines, one of the most pronounced findings from research and practice is that co-victims are at risk of a set of mental health conditions. So first, about 1 in 4 suffer from prolonged or complicated grief. Prolonged grief, which is sometimes referred to as complicated or traumatic grief, is a psychiatric disorder that's characterized by a preoccupation with and a longing for the deceased. Although grief is a normal reaction to loss, in prolonged grief, symptoms persist for an extended period of time after the loss has occurred and can interfere substantially with healthy functioning. Prolonged grief has been recognized as a disorder in the DSM since 2013. And it's also important to note that the rate of prolonged grief among homicide co-victims is about 2 times higher than the rate that's found among individuals who are bereaved by any cause. Additionally, approximately 1 in 5 homicide co-victims suffer from PTSD in their lifetimes, So this rate is about 3 times higher than that in the general public. And then finally, co-victimization is also associated with depression and substance use disorders. So I'd like to turn it over to Jeff for a few minutes. So we know, Jeff, that prolonged grief is an important issue for this population. Could you say a few words about your experience with how prolonged grief can manifest among co-victims? Okay, I'm not hearing Jeff. Jeff, did you get that?
I did.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Great.
You may have been muted. Yeah,
yes.
Go ahead.
Traumatic grief has all of the hallmarks of other types of trauma reactions, but it lays on top of the regular grief that someone would experience at a loss. And I think that traumatic grief can be especially difficult if the death was witnessed by the co-victim. So if someone's with their family member when they're killed, that can add another level because they actually have a visual recollection of what happened. As we see with other types of grief, the things that people have trouble with is there's a lot of confusion, and it's difficult for people in traumatic grief to just process and deal with everyday things. So when we work with homicide co-victims, we often will write things down because they won't remember them, or they might come and meet with us with a family member or friend who can help and who will also listen and hear what we're saying so that they can remind them, yes, don't you remember they talked to us about this. Even getting co-victims to do things like fill out forms for crime victim compensation or fill out a form to be notified by the prosecutor's office about what's going on in their case, those very simple administrative things can be difficult for victims to accomplish. Also, as another type of trauma reaction, a lot of victims are angry and distrustful, and advocates may often find themselves being questioned by co-victims, and sometimes there's a feeling of, well, wait a minute, I'm the good guy, I'm the one who's trying to help you. But that's a typical trauma reaction, and so we always try to remember that's, you know, they're not mad at us, they're just hurting, and we just happen to be close by. But that anger and distrust can also create some social barriers for victims as well, which can make it difficult for people to recover. And so I know I've worked with some where the co-victim has a prolonged focus on the homicide and continues to talk about it. And we as a culture oftentimes are very uncomfortable with death, and people think, oh, you know, it's been 6 months or it's been 9 months. Shouldn't they be over that by now? And friends will sometimes start to disassociate with the victim because it makes them uncomfortable, or they feel that the co-victims aren't moving forward. And that can exacerbate and prolong that feeling of isolation. I've known many, many victims who've complained that after they lost their loved one, they felt like they lost all of their friends as well. And these are all prolonged harms that we can see from victims, co-victims suffering from traumatic grief.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, that's really helpful to hear about some of those details. Okay, so I'll move to discussing some of the physical harms as well that homicide co-victims may face. So due to a high prevalence of prolonged grief, homicide co-victimization is a risk factor for a number of physical health issues. So specifically, it's a risk factor for cancer, heart trouble, and high blood pressure. And then research has also shown that among elderly individuals, prolonged grief is linked to bodily pain and poor physical health. And perhaps most urgently, prolonged grief is associated with an elevated risk of suicidal ideation and suicidality. So these associations, importantly, are independent of an individual's depressive symptoms. In terms of social and economic harms, there's less robust research evidence on these issues, but there is substantial qualitative research and practice-based evidence that's shown that co-victims face numerous social and economic harms. So for instance, a loved one's murder may be stigmatized within a family social circle or community, resulting in either real or perceived isolation and ostracizing by the community. And then in some cases, media coverage can amplify social stigma around the loss. And then at the same time, stress and trauma from the violent loss, which is what Jeff helpfully just talked about, these are thought to impede social relationships and can also lead to social isolation, as well as increased relationship conflicts and relationship dissatisfaction within families. So for example, homicide co-victims report feeling alone in their suffering, perceiving that others couldn't adequately understand their experience of loss. So finally, in terms of economic harms, co-victims who have lost a family member to homicide lose any economic support that their loved ones had provided. So this could be particularly detrimental if the deceased person had been a breadwinner or a primary child care provider. And in some cases, this could destabilize household finances. At the same time, there are immediate costs associated with a loved one's death. Funeral arrangements, as well as time away from work to manage those arrangements, can be a heavy burden on families. Additionally, costs may be incurred if the co-victim needs to pay for legal assistance and travel costs to attend court hearings. And although victim compensation funds are available to homicide co-victims, many may need help accessing those forms of financial support. So in addition to facing traumas and harms directly related to homicidal loss, extensive practice-based evidence shows that homicide co-victims face unique circumstances that put them at risk for secondary victimization and otherwise can interfere with their grieving and healing processes. Secondary victimization, as I'm sure most people in the audience are familiar with, is the process by which community members and/or individuals that are charged with helping crime victims, such as service providers or criminal justice actors, treat victims in a manner that minimizes their experience, shames them, or otherwise re-traumatizes them. Secondary victimization is of a particular concern to homicide co-victims because they often come into contact with institutions, including the criminal justice system, media, social services, and healthcare systems, which other mourners may not necessarily be compelled to interact with. Actors across these systems may not always be prepared to interface with co-victims in a trauma-informed manner. And at the same time, co-victims are not necessarily equipped to navigate those systems, which can result in frustration and fatigue during a time when they're especially vulnerable. Secondary victimization is particularly harmful if it discourages co-victims from seeking the help and support they need, and so it can be a barrier to healing. So to follow up with Jeff again, Jeff, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about some of the critical barriers to healing that co-victims face. So I know you mentioned a little bit about this just a moment ago, but if there are any additional kind of barriers to healing that are important.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I want to touch again on some of the things you mentioned about economic loss. Because one of the things that I've seen in working with homicide survivors is it's not, certainly it is more immediate and impactful where the deceased is a provider or head of household and now that that income is lost. But even where the homicide victim is a child, we find that there's tremendous economic loss because it's very difficult for traumatized people to return to work. I remember years ago working with a family whose daughter was a senior in high school and had been killed in a drive-by shooting, And I asked him if he had been able to go back to work yet, and he said, no, we haven't. And I know I've used up all of my annual leave and all of my sick leave, and we're eating into our retirement savings, and I know we're going to have to go back to work, but I just don't know how I'm going to do it. I recently spoke with a father who had lost his daughter to homicide, and he said he couldn't go back to work because he was an airline pilot, and he couldn't focus. And he says, and if that job, if you don't stay focused, people die. And so even if it's not the breadwinner who's been killed, that economic impact just can't be understated. There's also, as part of these barriers, is one of what I've begun to call sort of the myopia of grief. Those of us who have worked with victims know that there is, unfortunately, almost a hierarchy or caste system of victims in the minds of victims. And homicide survivors put themselves at the top of that. When they compare themselves to other victims and want to say that what has happened to them is worse than anything that's happened to anybody else. And for people who are homicide survivors, people who have lost their children tend to put themselves at the top of that group as well. And it becomes very difficult to get empathy or support from people if there is if traumatized folks tend to minimize other people's trauma and what they've experienced. I always tell homicide survivors as they start to navigate this path that it's really important to understand that all people can know and appreciate is the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And what's happened to some people might not be as bad as what's happened to them. And to really make an effort to accept comments in the spirit that they're offered. We all know from working with homicide survivors that people will say things trying to be helpful, but it ends up being very hurtful to folks. Oftentimes with homicide, I find it's a barrier where co-victims focus on external factors, like they might focus on a criminal trial and say, I'm going to get through this criminal trial, then everything's going to be okay. And then a year and a half or 2 years or more later, once that trial's concluded, regardless of what the outcome is, the co-victim finds, I still don't feel any better. And then they realize that I've been invested in this trial for 2 years and I haven't been focusing on my own personal recovery. And so I think those other factors can really be a barrier to people dealing with their own grief and getting help in processing their own recovery. I think it's really important for, at the appropriate time, for people to get back into a regular routine. It's almost like if you get knee replacement and certainly it's sore and you don't want to move it, but they tell you first thing you got to do is you've got to move that knee and you've got to get walking again, because if you don't, the longer you don't do it, it's going to be harder to make that happen. And even within families, I've seen people discuss this and have different approaches where a woman said, I felt I had to go back to work, and going back to work helped me because it gave me something to do and she found comfort in the routine. But her husband had not been able to go back to work and was not progressing in his healing, and she said, I think you need to go back to work because you're just wallowing in this. And so everybody approaches it differently, but there is comfort and structure in routine and helping to get victims used to what we call the new normal. Their life won't be the same, but they've got to learn how to function in that life, even though they've lost something as critical as someone who's lost a limb. They're going to still live, but they need to live that life differently. And so I think, and just on one final note, you're absolutely right that non-victim service professionals that people come in contact with oftentimes can be a barrier to healing. We've actually done trauma trainings for HR professionals where we found situations where those folks don't understand grief and unknowingly re-traumatize folks or make their transition back to work or getting benefits or getting assistance really complicated because they don't understand. And so I've always said that everyone has a role to play with serving victims, and we need to make sure that at some basic level, those folks that homicide co-victims are most likely to come in contact with have some basic training and understanding of this.
Okay, thanks so much, Jeff. And I know Marina has some practice evidence to cover that's along the same themes as well. So I will turn it over to Marina now, who's going to speak specifically about services and interventions.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Jeff, for all your input. So when I reviewed the registration roster, I saw that over 80% of people who registered for today's webinar identify themselves as practitioners and policymakers. And you've mentioned many reasons why you're interested in this webinar, but I think in summary, it's fair to say that such high interest from the practice field is a testament to how difficult it continues being to serve co-victims of homicide effectively, and also to know what research is available to back up those services and their effectiveness. So with that, let's dive into the types of services and interventions that are available. Sarah and Jeff have nicely described for us the complex needs among co-victims of homicide. Just to recap, there are 3 domains where co-victims continue struggling. One of them is, as many of you answered in the poll, addressing psychological harms. Another one is struggling to navigate the complicated and long criminal justice processes, and also dealing with media and negative societal attitudes. With the complexity of the services, of the needs that exist, we see in practice evidence that the services are rather disjointed. I would like to go over the types of services to address specifically psychological harm, but before I do that, I would love to hear back from you again. So if we still have our audience with us, if you could answer the question on what types of services do co-victims tend to primarily access. Please choose just one answer, and please think about co-victims you work with or study. So the answer choices are grief support groups, self-help groups, which are distinct in that they are organically organized and usually led by community leaders. Then we also have individual or group counseling or therapy. An example of a group therapy would be trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy that some of you might be familiar with, and also self-care. So let's take a moment and answer the polling question. And I will wait to hear the results. I'll give a minute for folks to respond, and we will review results together. Again, the choices are, okay, here we go, we have results. I think the results are quite interesting. We see that quite a few folks tend to work with co-victims of homicide who access individual or group counseling. People also know grief support groups, and then we have a bit on self-care and self-help. So let's move on to examine the strengths and limitations of each of this service type. We will start with grief support group. In our practice review, we saw that this is a type of service that is highlighted, at least online, quite a bit. One of the notable strengths for grief support groups is that they are very accessible, usually well advertised, and run by the nonprofits. They also can be cost efficient in that often they are led by volunteers, so it's cost efficient for the nonprofits or the agencies that run these grief support groups. Many of them, and that's a strength, are led by peers or people who have experienced losing a loved one to homicide themselves. Also, mixed composition of participants can be a strength. And what I mean by that is that if you are a type of a person who enjoys working in a group where people's grieving experiences differs from yours, then it can be a plus, and some practitioners noted that. And finally, another strength of grief support group is that they operate on open enrollment, so they are flexible. Participants can drop in and drop out as their schedule permits. Not surprisingly, probably to some of you, a mixed composition is also a limitation of grief support groups. Many practice evidence material pointed that, and Jeff told us that the dynamics of violent death is just very different. So it might be very difficult for participants to identify with other people who experience grief to natural causes and other reasons. Also, another limitation of grief support group is that it prompts participants to retell or relive the incident multiple times, which could be traumatizing for some. We also see that there is a lack of training among facilitators, and again, Jeff pointed to this. So the facilitators who do not have a violent experience in violent death dynamics might struggle facilitating the groups effectively. And there is lack of research specifically on whether grief support groups are effective for co-victims of homicide. I also differentiated self-help groups, and I know that researchers and practitioners do that as well. We do not see these groups especially present online as much, but we found them in areas that experience high rates of homicide, such as Baltimore or Chicago. They tend to be responsive to the needs in that community. They are led by invested peers and people just who have buy-in that community, and distinctly from grief support groups, they are more targeted to people who experience, who lost a loved one due to a homicide. There are some limitations, and some of them are more implicit, I would say. The groups tend to be limited to those participants who are aware about them, so they're not available to a large audience. It is unclear what level of skill the facilitators have and their training background. And finally, these groups, because they are community-driven, can be difficult to sustain. This slide is just an example of one of the grief support groups that we found. It's called it's the organization called Dougie Center in Oregon, and you can see in the picture that volunteers who lead these groups get together regularly and they debrief to prepare for the future sessions and also debrief about how the sessions went in the past. I also mentioned earlier that services that offer wraparound support are very scarce. So I wanted to highlight just two for you. One of them is criminal death support group, and it's a two-part intervention with 10 sessions in each. It's specifically focused on recruiting homicide co-victims, and they are offered a range of services to address both their psychological harms, but also to teach participants how to navigate media and criminal justice. And this model also uses what is called restorative retelling. If you're not familiar with it, it's a model designed to moderate internalized trauma and separation distress by focusing on three distinct processes. One is to restore resilience. Another one is to retell and commemorate the living memory of the deceased and self. And importantly, exposing and retelling the death story in a therapeutic, guided manner. And Jeff, I'm going to invite you very briefly right now to tell us also about a group that I know you attended and benefited from. Could you tell us what made it unique and how what you've gained from that group?
Sure. Back in 1995, I read in the newspaper about Crime Victims' Rights Week and learned that my local police department in Fairfax County, Virginia, had a support group for homicide survivors. And so I called the director of the Victim Witness Program, and she invited me to a meeting that very night. And when I went there, at that point, it had been 13 years since my sister had been murdered, but it was the very first time that I'd met another person who'd lost a loved one to homicide. And just like we did every time there was someone new, everyone went around the table and told their story, and oftentimes they talked about their grievances with the criminal justice system. So they were able to provide services to help those co-victims navigate the criminal justice system and its response to their loved one's homicide, but also to provide peer support and psychological help to sort of break down that isolation because they were with other people who were experiencing similar things. I think one of the great benefits of peer support groups is having people at different places in their recovery, because someone who's much more, the homicide they experienced was more recent, and they go to a peer support group and they say, wow, look at Sally. I mean, her homicide happened 2 years ago, but she looks great. Her hair's combed, she's dressed well, she's functioning in life. If Sally can do it, maybe I can do that too. And so it's an opportunity to model good recovery behavior. But I also know from working with groups around the country that sometimes people are somewhat resistant to the idea of a support group. I worked with a group in Chicago, and they said, if we say we're having a support group, 15 people will come, but if we say, come paint your loved one's shoes, 80 people will show up. And so they're looking to find ways about how you can bring people together and maybe while you're doing an activity be able to facilitate peer support without something that's necessarily identified or feels too much like a structured support group. And I think all of those types of services can really help victims navigate this path.
Thank you so much, Jeff. We're going to move on to two more types that I've identified earlier. Lots of you chose individual and group counseling, so I'm going to skip over the strengths of this type of intervention. I do want to point out that many low-income co-victims of homicide continue being unable to access these services because simply they're just cost prohibitive and a lot of services might not be covered. I also did want to emphasize self-care because a lot of practitioners point to this type of support as an important intervention or help that is available for participants, particularly because self-care can be conducive to long-term coping skills. Services can come and go, some of them are not available, but developing something that people can own is very important. The limitations are that a lot of self-care is self-guided, and if you did not have experience with this, it can be limiting, and you just do not know how to support yourself. It also is difficult to undertake. We've seen practitioners saying that it's difficult to undertake soon after death, and finally, research on homicide co-victims is lacking in this domain. I'm going to skip over the quote just to make sure that we run on time because I know we don't have that much time left. Sara has touched upon the criminal justice system and how it can cause secondary traumatization. In review of practice material, we've seen that notable national organizations identify a couple of evidence-based practices or promising practices for police, prosecutors, and courts. And I'm just going to highlight very few here. One is that police are often, as we know, first bearers of the news. So it's very important to deliver those news with compassion. The FBI and Penn State University have developed wonderful training resource on how to respond effectively and what protocols each law enforcement agency should have. But it is unclear how much law enforcement accesses this. And also, I will be remiss to say if I do not mention victim advocates, both in prosecutors' offices and police. They play a very important role by offering emotional support, educational information, and helping co-victims navigate the complicated criminal justice processes. And finally, with post-conviction, as we know, co-victims of homicide go through a very long process, and a lot of national prominent organizations emphasize not to overpromise the myth of closure that many co-victims of homicide might not reach. A couple of barriers that I didn't mention yet is that some victims continue experiencing difficulties accessing services because of historically strained relationship with police. Also, I've already mentioned that a lot of people who are uninsured and underinsured struggle to engage in counseling that has research behind it. We also have not seen too many groups that are available in languages other than English. So people with limited English proficiency struggle to access the services. And also, some practitioners who work with tribal communities know the lack of cultural competency, and I say that the Western concepts are not always conducive to healing concepts in Native communities. We are now moving to just our key takeaways and about where the field needs to grow and what we've seen in research and practice. And I'm going to turn it over to Sara now to walk us through key takeaways from research. Sara?
Yep. Okay, I just wanted to move to the next slide. So in terms of research, one of the key areas that the field needs to grow in is developing better estimates of prevalence and risk factors. So few studies have examined individual, household, and community level risk factors for homicide co-victimization. One of the most important things researchers need to produce is up-to-date national estimates of prevalence. I will say that just last week there was a new article published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence that has new estimates of national prevalence for youth who are homicide co-victims. So that is obviously a big step forward for the field, but we do need new up-to-date estimates for adults and adolescents as well. There's also a lack of information on risks among vulnerable populations. As we've talked about earlier, this is especially true for the Native American community. And then finally, there are very few studies on physical health and economic well-being.
Great. Thank you very much, Sara. On practice, I'm going to emphasize once again that there is a lack of wraparound services to help victims heal and move forward. Also, there are very few evaluations that look at what services work and for whom. It remains also unclear to what extent grief support groups are effective for those who lose a loved one to violent death as compared to natural causes. And finally, we've emphasize this, but I want just to make sure that if anything, we all remember that services are lacking in socioeconomically disadvantaged communities where homicide rates are disproportionately high. In terms of policy, states continue having variations in what can be covered and what type of services co-victims can reach. So depending on where you live, you might have a very different grieving experience. And also, as I mentioned before, expanding insurance coverage for counseling might improve access for low-income individuals, and that should continue being a priority. So with that, we're just going to leave the slide here with key takeaways. I think we can move on because we do not have that much time, and I wanted to turn it over to Susan, who could guide us through Q&A. I would love to hear back from the audience. Susan?
All right, thanks so much, Marina. Sorry for that delay. We do already have one question from an audience member, and that is, does any of the research that you all have reviewed include specific data on the unique needs of co-victims in cold cases?
So I'll just jump in quickly and then maybe pass it to Marina, but I will say there is some qualitative research that looks at the needs of co-victims in cold case homicides situations, and obviously it's a very tough situation because there's a lot of uncertainty and certainly a lack of closure that can be really pronounced for that group. I think that unfortunately this is an area where quantitative data is really lacking, and so we don't have any very specific information about how their needs might be different from other homicide co-victims. Marina, I don't know if there's anything from the practice side that you wanted to add to that.
No, Sara, you covered all of it. Thank you.
Okay, while we are waiting for some additional questions, and remember, you can enter your questions in the chat box. I want to let you all know that if you need a certificate of attendance from today's presentation, you can email our liaison, Lindsay Claude, and I'm going to put her email in the chat box right now. That's lclaude@victimsofcrime.org, and she will be able to get you a certificate of attendance. We have another question. Has there been any research on victim-offender dialogues as it relates to co-victims of homicide?
That's a great question. So again, I'll jump in and then see if Marina wants to add anything from the practice side. So I have seen just a handful of articles that look at restorative justice in this particular situation. I don't think that there's any particular perspective that is shared by different researchers in the field. It might be different on the practice side. But it's a very touchy subject just because obviously in cases that are this extreme where someone, where a homicide has been committed, it's obviously very sensitive and can be really tricky to effectively have some sort of restorative justice session or series of sessions with both the offender and the folks who are the homicide co-victims.
And I would just add, Sarah, right, in practice, we've seen that there was one case in Florida where the restorative justice process was actually applied post-conviction. It was very draining and very difficult. It's been highlighted in the media and everything that Sarah said. It requires a lot of skill to facilitate these groups and criminal justice agencies to come together and work with families in order not to cause further harm. And as to my knowledge, in reviewing the practice material, this was the only case from Florida, post-conviction, I mean. And there is just really a handful before conviction where it was applied, but it's a very nascent area, as in nascent stages, as Sarah mentioned.
Well, this is Susan. I just would like to say there is a great interest in restorative justice, including in homicide cases, and this is an area that researchers are starting to look at, and CVR will make sure that we have a special focus on that because I know the VOCA rule now allows services in this area, so we really will be looking at that. We have a couple of additional questions. Are practitioners having success with utilizing EMDR for treatment? That's I forget what it stands for, but it's rapid eye movement therapy. Did you come across that?
I saw that question. Thank you, Susan. On the practice side, we did not look at that as part of the review, but I already made a note for myself and would love to connect with folks who are working in this area to continue this discussion and think through how to advance our knowledge. I don't know if Sarah or Jeff had any comments.
It's unfortunately not something that I've seen on the research side at all, so I'm not going to speak to that, I guess.
Probably the research or you did not come across that in research that was specific to homicide survivors as opposed to the other research on EMDR.
Yeah, correct. Thanks for clarifying, Susan.
Does the data that you used mention homicide co-victims who have experienced post-conviction exonerations? And is there any indication that that can be a complicating factor where the offender is exonerated later?
That's a great question. So I'll just jump in. So in our review of research materials, we didn't see anything that was specific to this exact topic, but what did come up, which I think is sort of in a similar vein, the discussion of whether or not the death penalty is something that is helpful or not to co-victims. And as you might imagine, it's a very controversial topic for researchers and practitioners as well. And I don't think there's kind of a clear indication or clear evidence about whether or not that particular policy is helpful for co-victims or not. But I think similarly to how Marina just offered, I'm happy to connect via email if someone would be interested in seeing those particular articles. They might kind of shed a light on some of the other questions that were just asked.
All right, there's a question for Jeff specifically. Jeff, have you seen other types of events that you would recommend that can bring co-victims together? The questioner recently started a support group but has not had a great turnout, I suppose, like the Chicago experience you mentioned.
You know, I think any type of activity, things that bring families together, and just think about an event that someone might enjoy doing, and if you can just get anything to get people together, whether it's picnics or outings or anything like that, or a game night where people can just come together, and then while they're engaged in some activity, they'll talk to each other, and it's just a chance to connect. I know that sometimes I had an advocate tell me once that, you know, she had a hard time communicating with a male homicide co-victim, and she was based in Alaska, and she said she took him fishing. Now, not everybody has that option, but I had another advocate tell me that she kept a deck of cards in her desk, and when he came by, if they played cards, he'd talk to her. And so it's trying to think of different approaches that will work for folks. Sometimes it's going to be a guest speaker, where in Fairfax, they might have someone come in and from the criminal investigations police unit and talk about why they do what they do with a homicide investigation. And sometimes people who are involved in that are going to find that interesting and will turn out for that. But I think keep trying different things and see what works.
Great, thank you. We had a question for the researchers. Was there a particular place, an agency or an organization that conducted restorative retelling and criminal death support groups that you looked at?
Yes, there was, and I'll let Marina speak to that.
I'm sorry, Susan, could you please repeat the question?
Yes, was there a particular agency or organization that you came across that was using restorative retelling and criminal death support groups?
Right, yes, so the service that I highlighted, the criminal death support group, existed in San Diego and actually was applied in multiple communities. But according to what I know, that service has been discontinued due to lack of funding and just changes in the community.
Great, thank you very much, Marina. We had another question. Do you know what the research says about the outcomes for children who witnessed the death of a parent to homicide?
That's a great question. So I think that for that, there wasn't specific findings from the research that we reviewed on homicide co-victimization broadly, but just speaking from the literature on adverse life experiences and research from ACEs, I mean, you could easily imagine that children who are witnessing death or a homicide, it's obviously an adverse life experience and could be particularly traumatic, especially at that developmental stage. But that's a question that I would also be happy to send some relevant articles to the person who asked about it, since it wasn't explicitly something that we covered in our review.
Okay, great. I realize that we are over time. I want to let people know that when we circulate the slides, along with the link to the recording, you will see a number of the references that were used in the development of this synthesis. We will also include links to the resources that were discussed in this presentation. Thanks to everyone who shared your own ideas, and we will be taking a look back at the questions to make sure that we didn't miss anything, and we'll address those and circulate those as well when we send out the link to the recording and the other resources. So I want to thank our presenters one more time for all of their hard work in pulling this together for us. This is such an under-examined area, and we're really pleased that CVR was able to have our first research synthesis focus on this area. So thanks again, and thanks to everyone who joined us today and for even staying overtime with us. Please join us for the next webinar, and we'll see you later. Bye.